and I are delighted this quarter to be tagging along with so many events organized by other groups on campus. So this is actually organized by the Brazil Working Group. So I'm going to let Lucia, who organized this visit and is co-directing the group, to introduce our speaker. Let me just mention, for those of you in the colloquium, next week there's going to be a graduate student sort of mini symposium. It was announced on the syllabus and calendar for 12 to 5 p.m. We've actually decided, again, to join up with another great event that's going on, which is Richard Kagan speaking to the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. So we'll have the our departmental event, which is a transatlantic studies symposium, papers reflecting on transatlantic studies. We thought Richard Kagan's talk on colonial cities and his own work fits very well within that rubric. But we'll start here, go from about 12 to 2. We're working on having lunch here for folks. And then at 2:30, head over for Richard Kagan, which we can treat a little bit like a keynote, hopefully. Those talks, if you've never been to them, they're always followed also by a really nice informal roundtable. They have food and coffee as well. And we've already floated the idea of continuing the discussion of transatlanticism in that roundtable. So we hope you'll join us for some or all of that next week. And I'll turn it over to myself.
Good afternoon, boa tarde. So this is as Lisa mentioned, this is sponsored by the department, the Center for Latin American Studies, but it's the first, guest that we have for the working group in Brazil. So hopefully the next one, which is going to be probably in the spring, will be on contemporary Brazil. But we are delighted to have Professor Metcalf here. Her work intersects with, medieval Renaissance studies and, of course, peninsular, Latin American colonial. And Professor Metcalf was generous enough to come at this time that she's working on a book right now, in fact, 2 projects. But she graduated from Smith College with a BA from Smith College, master's and PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. And since then, she has been publishing extensively on very exciting topics. Her first book was on family and frontier in colonial Brazil. Her second book is Go-Betweens and the Colonization of Brazil. And her third forthcoming book is going to be also on a very exciting topic. The book is forthcoming in December. It is The Return of Hans Staden. And so it's coming up in December, correct? By, what is the press?
Johns Hopkins.
Johns Hopkins. And she's also working on 2 other projects that are very important for not only colonial Brazil, but cultural studies as a whole. She's working with a colleague from Rice University. She's coming from Rice University, and the project is on architectural history of Rio de Janeiro. And the other project is, as I mentioned, which is the project that's coming up, the book that's coming out in December. And today she'll be speaking on, we have the first representations of Brazil on world maps. I want also to thank Ashley and Erica that have been very helpful in communicating with Alida during the summer. So we welcome her and thank everybody who participated in my the co-chair of the Brazilian working group that just arrived. We also have Professor Mariana Dantas from Ohio University. So thank you all for being here. Yes. So thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's my first visit to Ohio State, and I'm really enjoying my visit so far. I wanted to thank Lucia for the invitation for coming, and Ashley for making everything so easy. And I'll be speaking to you today about, it's really the first chapter of my new book, so I need you to be as ruthless as possible without reducing me to nothing, so that I can really go somewhere with this project. I'm really excited about it. It's has to do with the iconography of Brazil as it appears on the early maps of Brazil in the 16th century. And some of you may be familiar with Darlene Sadlier's book, Brazil Imagined. And in her first chapter, she talks about some of how powerful some of the early images are of Brazil. And so what I want to do is kind of return to those images and see what they are and how they came about. So I'm going to start today with these two maps, the Cantino map and the Waldseemüller map. And when Lisa was saying that Richard Kagan's going to be here soon, I noticed that the poster for his visit that's posted out in the hall is the Waldseemüller map. So when he comes here, you can all be extremely up to date on the Waldseemüller map, perhaps know more about it than him. Okay, so here's the paradox that I'm working with, that I want to start off with, which is that we know this. Maps powerfully shape perceptions. We know this. We know that maps are not just the documents that we use to get from A to B, that maps are very powerful documents because they encode so many meanings. So we know that maps powerfully shape perceptions. But maps are also very ephemeral. I mean, all of you have thrown away maps in your life, probably a lot of maps. And now that you have digital maps, you're deleting them constantly. So there's this interesting paradox between the fact that a map is shaping perceptions, yet at the same time, a map can be very ephemeral. So kind of working with those two ideas, what I want to do in this talk with you today is to explore the two maps that first show Brazil, the two world maps that first show Brazil, and kind of take you through what those maps are, the traditions they came from, how they were made, and then we'll get to the iconography that comes about on these two maps. So the first map is the Cantino map. This is my absolute most famous map in the world, and I'm sure many of the rest of you have seen it and admired it before. This comes out of the tradition of nautical cartography. It's a sea chart or a portolano, but writ large. In other words, it's taking that tradition and making it into a world map. And so it's very distinctive for that reason. It's very big. It's 7 feet long and 3 feet tall. It's in the library in the Biblioteca Estense Universitaria in Ferrara in Italy. And it was obviously a very luxurious map at the time that it was made. It's filled with those beautiful illuminations, which we'll talk about more in a minute. And in fact, it was intended to be a gift. So if you see the map or a facsimile of the map, underneath this corner on the back of the map is written in Italian that it's a gift to the Duke of Ferrara from Alberto Cantino, who was one of his sort of agents, who was in Lisbon in 1502 and somehow got a hold of this map. The cartographer is anonymous, and one of the things I want to point to right away are these crisscrossing lines, which are the RUM lines, or as I tell my students, R-H-U-M-B, not R-U-M. They're not RUM lines, they're RUM lines. Okay, so that's our first map. Here's our second map. This is the famous world map by Martin Waldseemüller that was printed in 1507, most likely in Strasbourg in Germany. And it's the first map that has the word America on it right here. And this is the map that the Library of Congress paid $10 million for, and it's now on permanent display at the Library of Congress in a specially designed case that's supposed to withstand hurricanes and typhoons and cyclones and so forth. So the next time you go to Washington, you absolutely have to see this map. It's also huge. It's 8 feet by 4 feet. And it was part of a publication event, kind of. I'm not sure what the right word is, but it was published with a small book and another printed sheet of what are called globe gores, which meant you could cut them up and paste them on a ball. So Waldseemüller had this huge map, created this huge map, had it printed a book at the same time, and a little globe that you could buy. And in the book that went along with this map, the first half of the book was basically on principles of geography and cartography drawn from the Alexandrian geographer Ptolemy, who was rediscovered in the Renaissance. And in the second half of the book, it's Vespucci's 4 letters, which are known as the Soderini letter. And these are the 4 most difficult letters of Vespucci, because they're the ones that seem to be the most fraudulent, or at least parts of them. So you've got this interesting juxtaposition of this sort of erudite text on astronomy and mathematics and how to draw a map projection, combined with this traveler's narrative of Vespucci's 4 voyages. Okay, so if we look at the 2 maps, here we have Brazil here and Brazil here. And as I'm going to suggest, the iconography on Brazil is pretty straightforward. We've got parrots on both maps. We've got a ship on one map. We've got Brazil in the ocean on both maps. But my question is, how do we get to this? How do we get to the depiction of Brazil as the land of the cannibals? This is, in 1546, Sebastian Münster's map. And I should say that these maps were all printed in black and white, but often they were hand-colored. So really, I should have taken the time to get a black and white slide here. And the map that's advertising Richard Kagan's lecture, which is the Waldseemüller map, is also colored. But the actual map that we have, the surviving map, is this black and white map. But that's just an aside. So my question is, how do we get to this? How do we get to this image that Brazil is the land of cannibals? And you see this imagery over and over and over again. And yet this is, only 40 years after the Waldseemüller map. So what's happening? Well, you might say, well, this is what happens with the print medium. But if you look at the manuscript map tradition, also the imagery over Brazil is very stylized. So here we have a map from 1558 that shows Brazil. It's a manuscript map, in other words, painted, hand-painted. And the imagery over Brazil is pretty stylized, not so much as the other one, but also with this imagery of cannibalism. Okay, so let's go back to our 2 maps and try and figure out what's going on in these maps and how do we understand why they were made in the way that they were made, and what do they tell us about how Brazil is being perceived in the first years of the 16th century. So first I want to talk about the tradition out of which the Cantino map came, which was the tradition of the Portrayed chart, or the Portolano. And these were the kinds of charts that were developed in the Mediterranean. They go back to the 13th and 14th centuries. They were the practical kinds of maps that were taken to sea or were looked at by merchants and other investors on land, but that showed where things were in the Mediterranean. They were also accompanied by these books called roteiros, which were like log books, where they fit the sort of thick description idea where when sailors would sail, they would write these very thick descriptions of where they were, what the land looked like, what the water looked like, what the animals were doing, changes different times of the year. And so you can go back and read these roteiros that were written in particular by the Portuguese and discover a lot of very interesting description that was written down. And these were very useful, in some cases more useful than having a chart, because you could know where you were by understanding the description of where you were. Okay, so the Cantino is coming out of this nautical chart tradition, or the sea chart tradition, or this Portolano tradition. So what was that? Well, here's a very good example of a beautiful Portolan chart that's in the James Ford Bell Library. And so you can see certain characteristics. First of all, the coastline is very important. The names are written at right angles to the coast. So these would be the names of the places, the names of, a river mouth, say, or the name of a port. They're crossed by our rum lines, okay? And they're often illuminated. A high-end Portolan chart would typically be illuminated, which meant that it would have these drawings on it, things like flags, cityscapes. So this here is Granada, and because the crescent flag is flying over it, that's often used as a way of dating the map, saying, okay, Granada hadn't fallen yet, so therefore this chart was made during the time when Granada was still under a Muslim king. So the Portolan charts are, can be very ornate, but they are very practical utilitarian documents. So this is a very famous Portuguese chart. It's considered to be the oldest surviving chart. What we're seeing here is that whereas normally the Portolan charts showed the Mediterranean and were done kind of horizontally so that the neck of the chart was usually over on this side, okay? Once the Portuguese start sailing out into the Atlantic and sailing south along the coast of Africa, they start to turn the chart around, because typically each chart was the size of one animal skin. So this was, a goat skin or a sheep skin or a calf skin that was turned into parchment or vellum. And so the top of the chart here, or the neck, was usually over on this side when you were showing the Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean would just sort of spread out like that. But when the Portuguese start to sail along the coast of Africa, they turn the chart around, but they essentially keep the same kind of chart making going. They're essentially just slightly modifying things to take advantage of the fact that they've got new places to put on their chart. And this chart is particularly interesting because this segment of coastline actually adds on right here, and there's a slight overlap. So you see this Portuguese flag here, and here it is here. So this goes down here, but there wasn't, it was going to cost a whole nother skin to put that coastline on, so it's easier just to stick it up here. And this has presented a lot of problems with trying to figure out how to date the chart. So that's why there are these two sets of dates that are usually given for this particular chart. Okay, now a chart like this is made. Let's go back to the Mediterranean one. So you have to imagine this chart kind of going out this way into the Mediterranean. One of the way in which the different points on this chart were determined where they were was by taking compass readings. Okay, so the Portolan charts always had north at the top, and they were based on the readings that you took from compasses. But there's always a slight error, because magnetic north is not the same as true north. So when you've got your compass, it's pointing to magnetic north, but that's not really true north. So there's always going to be a little bit of error in these charts. But the pilots and the sailors who were sailing around the Mediterranean had been doing that for generations, so they knew that there was going to be, the charts weren't going to be absolutely right. Plus they had their roteiros, plus they'd made these trips many times before. So it wasn't really such a problem in the Mediterranean. Now you get out into the Atlantic and you've got a big problem because, first of all, you're going into unknown waters, and your errors are going to be greater the farther south you go. Plus, you're going to get to a certain point where you can no longer see the North Star, and therefore you're going to have to find another way to start to navigate. So the invention that's made that's developed for use at sea is the famous astrolabe, which you see here. You hold it up like this, and you hold it at noontime, and the light of this is a bad example because we were supposed to be practicing this, but we spent so long getting ready that by the time we actually practiced, the sun was so low on the horizon. So this thing is supposed to be up here. The sunlight's supposed to be coming in right through here, and then you can tell. You can then, with another table, figure out the altitude of the sun, and that's what was used on the Portuguese charts to figure out where the latitudes were. So what starts to happen is that the Portuguese develop a kind of hybrid chart. It's using true observations that they're taking, readings they're taking of the sun at midday that are getting recorded on here, and they're pretty good. They're pretty accurate in terms of determining their latitude. But the charts are accumulating errors because of the magnetic declension problem, and also because of the problem of how do you measure how far you're going at sea, okay? They have these system where you throw these little pieces of wood over and you turn over the hourglass, and I mean you can't really measure accurately how far you're going at sea until the 18th century. So these charts are kind of a mishmash, but the pilots know that, and the navigators know that, and they know that the charts aren't like our modern maps that are exactly accurate. So the Cantino chart is coming out of this tradition of nautical charts, and it has all of the strengths and all of the weaknesses of that tradition. Okay, the Waldseemüller map is coming out of the Ptolemaic tradition, and Ptolemy was this geographer who lived in Alexandria in the 4th century AD. And his work was rediscovered in the Renaissance. It was never totally lost, but it became popularized in the Renaissance. And it became extremely influential because Ptolemy essentially described how you can show where places are by determining their latitude and longitude. Okay, so the concept of latitude and longitude goes back to Ptolemy, and even before him, to earlier Greek geographers. And so when he's kind of rediscovered in the Renaissance, the humanists are extremely interested in what they're learning from Ptolemy. So Waldseemüller, our guy who made this map, was your classic humanist. And he was interested in showing that the new discoveries that had been made by the Spanish and the Portuguese fit into the world as Ptolemy had envisioned it. So here is a famous edition of Ptolemy's Geographia that was published in the late 15th century. And this is kind of the way in which Renaissance humanists were imagining the world. So you can see that there's a grid for latitude and longitude, and you can see the known world, the Mediterranean, Africa, Europe, Asia, okay? But implicit in this idea was that you could also map everything in the world, that Ptolemy gave you the tools, Ptolemy gave you the concepts that you could use to include new parts of the world, in other words, the other side of the world, which is what Waldseemüller is trying to do here. He's trying to show how you fit these new discoveries into this Ptolemaic model, okay? Some other things I just want to point out quickly about Ptolemy. You'll see that, first of all, no route around Africa, okay? The seas tend to be enclosed by land, so he has the idea of oceans being enclosed by land. And then in this particular, when this is kind of a common rendition of the world, there's this sense of the known world and then the vast unknown world of the ocean. So the ocean, kind of this immense place that's dominated by these winds that determine where you can go when you're out in the ocean. Okay, so Ptolemy came up with projections. These are what you have to do in order to represent the world, which is round on a flat surface. So he came up with these projections, saying in his work that was, republished in the Renaissance, this is what you have to do if you want your map to really be accurate. And so Waldseemüller takes this projection and modifies it in order to in order to make his map. Now, the projections are going to matter in terms of how Brazil is represented, because the Portrayed charts typically were drawn without projections, because they were just charts to get you from here to there, and so they didn't really take the curvature of the Earth into account. And the Cantino map consisted of all these different charts that the anonymous cartographer all put together. So there's no overarching projection that fits everything together. He's not trying to get everything, into here or into here. But Waldseemüller is trying to have a realistic projection. Oops. So if you look at how Brazil physically looks, its shape, this is due to the projection. So here's Waldseemüller with the modified Ptolemaic projection, which makes South America look very elongated. But it's also kind of eerily like the way the continent of South America looks, especially in some of the more modern projections that have been developed. And this sense of the Pacific here, for 1507 is really uncanny. How did he get that? Was this just luck? Or did he have sources that we don't know about? In any event, this elongated shape is created by the projection that he used. And the absence of a projection over here, and the sense that the anonymous cartographer who made the Cantino map was sort of laying out Brazil as if it were on a sea chart, is why the shape of the coast and the sense of the density of the mainland is present. Okay. All right. So now I want to change gears and talk about the artists. And this is the part Lisa's going to like the best, I'm guessing. Okay, so both of these maps are also works of art. So what role does the artist play in shaping the way the maps were made and the way Brazil is represented? So we've got two very different mediums. We've got the print medium, which already we have the sense of a large print workshop, right, in our minds, with typesetters and woodcutters and the printer and so forth. But the Portrayed charts were all made in much more, what we would think of as very old-fashioned medieval ateliers, workshops where you can imagine a family of cartographers where you'd have, you know, the main cartographer with his sons, maybe even daughters, working with him as scribes or illuminators, using you know, sort of techniques characteristic of how you would illuminate manuscripts in the Middle Ages. But my question is, you know, what is the influence of the artist? And I want to suggest that it's actually quite important that the artists are leaving their mark on these maps, and so we should not just be thinking of the map as a creation of the cartographer, but we have to also consider what the influence of the artist is. Okay, so let's deal with the Waldseemüller map first because it's the more complicated. Waldseemüller would have started out probably with sheets of paper, and he would have drawn the map on sheets of paper, and he would have, you know, just like any scholar today, he would have consulted books, and he would have, you know, gone and looked at maps, and he would have created this map. But it was going to be a printed map, and they eventually, he claims they pulled 1,000 copies of this map. So the process was then going to be to transform his drawing into a woodcut. So here's our Formschneider or woodcutter. And the woodcutter is going to cut the blocks. And for this map, I think there were 16 huge blocks about this big, which were made by sort of joining planks together. And then the woodcutter had to carve every single block backwards because the ink adhered to the ridges, and the part that was down below was going to end up being white. So there's a huge intervention here by the woodcutter. The woodcutter is going to have to take whatever Waldseemüller has drawn and, you know, transform it onto the block. But in addition, his map is full of text. So we're also going to have text on the map, some of which is going to be hand-carved by our woodcutter, but some of it is going to be set by our typesetter and actually stuck into the block. And then the whole thing is going to be printed. So there were, I think I'm right, 16 sheets. Okay, so they were going to make 1,000 copies of 16 sheets and package them together for sale. Okay, now some interesting things when we start to look at close-ups of the map. So this is the sign of the ocean. This is how the woodcutter is cutting the block to represent the ocean. Now there are many ways the ocean could be represented, but on this particular map, this is obviously the intervention of the woodcutter or the artist who designed parts of the map, which we'll get to in a second. And here's another sign of the ocean and the ocean waves that appear in the Waldseemüller map. So this gives it a very artistic side, okay, that's coming from the artist working on the map. Okay, now the text on the map is very interesting. So some of the text on the map is set in Roman type in Latin, okay? And the Roman type was very much preferred by humanists during the Renaissance. It was considered very elegant, and you know, kind of went back to the Romans. So these were the kinds of capitals that you found, like here, inscribed on Roman, you know, stones and so forth. And then there was a lowercase that was created to go along with it. And this is one of the top legends of the map that's very beautifully done. I mean, you have to look at that and say, you know, that's very nicely set. It looks really great. So somebody had carefully set this and proofread the Latin. And although I'm not very good at Latin, I've read this, so I'm going to tell you it's true. There aren't very many mistakes in this. The Latin's pretty darn good. So I can't verify that for you. And then, in addition, you have other pieces of text that are cut into the block, okay? So this is a label of the ocean. You see this? Oceanus Occidentalis, okay? So that was actually carved directly into the block backwards, whereas this one was typeset by the typesetter and kind of screwed into the block. Then you have some Gothic legends, such as off the coast of Brazil. So this is Gothic, a kind of Gothic type that was also used a lot in the Renaissance. The humanists didn't like it as much, but it was very common. And this is a whole different kind of type. And this variation in type is useful because it provides clues as to where this map might have been printed. Okay, and some of the legends have a mixture of type. So we've got Roman on the top and Gothic on the bottom. And so one of the studies that's been done of the Waldseemüller map argues that this Gothic typeset Latin text is full of mistakes, whereas the Roman typeset text is quite good. And so it seems as though the map was started in one location with one set of type and then finished in another location with another set of type. And one thing to keep in mind here, you'll see this again when I bring the map back up, there is a lot of text on this map, and so it's a lot of letters that a printer is tying up from his shop in just this one project. So they might have run out of type, or the printer might have gotten into a fight with them for some reason or another, but for whatever reason, there seems to have been a transformation that took place in terms of how the map was set up. Okay, now this is one of the sheets on the map. And this is one of the two top central sheets. This is Ptolemy right here. So here we have one of our legends. Here we have our various wind heads. Okay, we've got our Arctic Circle here. We've got our Ptolemaic projection. But to me, it's impossible to imagine that Waldseemüller did this. Waldseemüller did this, fine. Waldseemüller did this. This is Albrecht Dürer quality. This is either Albrecht Dürer or one of his followers. So there was a pretty major artist who was involved in designing this map. And they designed probably the sign of the ocean, the portrait of Ptolemy, the wind heads, the clouds. And that creates a huge artistic influence that goes beyond what the cartographer did. So here's an example of, this is from the Waldseemüller map, and this is, I'm afraid, not a very good, but this is from one of Dürer's Apocalypse prints from a few years before. So you can see that there are lots of similarities here suggesting that we're dealing with a master artist, woodcut artist in Germany at the time that this map was created. Okay, so let's go to our Portolan school, to our Cantino chart. And as I said, the Portolanos were made in workshops. They were made in small family workshops. They used traditional kinds of things like parchment, vellum, ink, paints, brushes, quill pens, okay? And there are certain kinds of things that you tend to see repeated on these Portolan charts, such as these elaborate compass roses. This is a compass rose that shows us the different points of the compass and our famous rum lines radiating off of them. So turning now to the Cantino, here we have an illumination of Jerusalem that's very nicely drawn in with a good deal of perspective. And here we see the evidence of the paint, the colors, the flags, and here we have the coast of the Mediterranean with our names inked in, and a label for Jerusalem, handwritten in a Gothic script. Oops, it's going too fast. Another characteristic of the Portrayed charts, the high-end Portrayed charts, was they often painted the Red Sea red. So typically the Red Sea here would appear as red, and over here is the Persian Gulf painted in blue. So this is expensive to add all of this extra illumination, and it's an indication that it was meant to be a map for a powerful patron. In terms of the text on the Cantino map, there's not nearly as much text as on the Waldseemüller, but the text that's on the map is more is more even in the sense that it matches. So all of the big legends are in hand-lettered Gothic script, and they're either in Latin or in Portuguese. So here we have the Antilles of the King of Castile in Portuguese, but up top here, Oceanus Occidentalis in Latin. So the cartographer knows some Latin, not very much, but enough Latin to label things. Then everything else, every other big legends are going to be in Portuguese. The names of the places are going to be in Portuguese. And there are also little legends that are in a cursive script that are typically in Portuguese. Here's the compass rose on the Cantino map, which is a beautiful decorative compass rose. And this is where we get our modern, design of the compass comes from these Portrayed charts, and specifically the Portuguese Portrayed charts. So you see here, this pointer is going to eventually push out from the circle and be the top of the compass rose. So here you have the direction of east, and then these are the 32 different points of the compass with the rhumb lines emanating out from them. Okay. Oops. Here are our famous rhumb lines, which were color-coded. There were green, red, and blue, I believe. And you could, a navigator did not need the compass rose. The navigator knew what this line was because it was color-coded. So he knew it was the southwest, such and such of a direction, or the northeast, such and such a direction. So all over the Cantino map, this network of rhumb lines actually has a practical purpose, even though this map would never have been taken to sea. It was too big. Okay, so here we finally are at our images of Brazil. What do we have? So if we look at the images of Brazil, first of all, we have our parrots, and we have our forest. And I think, to me, this is really, really interesting, because if you're on the ship and you're sailing along the coast of Brazil in 1500, what are you going to notice? You're going to notice the land, and you're trying to give a sense of what the land looks like, and so you're essentially depicting the Atlantic forest in these trees. Many of the early accounts of Brazil talk about parrots. This particular cartographer would not have been able to have read a single account of Brazil. In 1502, when this map was made, he was getting his information from sailors and pilots and navigators and merchants and anyone who'd actually been to Brazil on the 2 expeditions that had gone there. And it's very likely that these parrots were drawn from life, from either parrots that had come back from Brazil on a ship, or possibly even the illuminator of this map had been to Brazil. That's not completely out of the question. We also have flags marking possession on, indicating that sort of in the future, the Portuguese are going to attempt to possess this land. And I should add that the treaty line of Tordesillas is also on this chart. So those are the three main images we see for Brazil, on the Cantino. For the Waldseemüller, we have the parrot, but notice the difference in the parrot. The parrot is much, much simpler. It's probably not drawn from life. It's not deemed important to get the parrot as accurate as possible. Could they have done so in the woodcut medium? Absolutely. You know, there's a Dürer woodcut of Adam and Eve where people can identify the exact parrot that's in that woodcut. But this here, it's not important to make that parrot look like the real thing. Besides, there's a label underneath it in Latin that says red parrot. So it just has to suggest the parrot. Whereas over here, the parrot has to almost be the parrot. The parrot's almost flying out of the image. And so here, what's really being valued in the illuminations in this chart are what is seen. You know, what is being seen when you sail along the coast of Brazil, and that fits, because elsewhere on the chart, and this is true in the Portrayed charts in general, they often try to make the coast look like the way it looked from sea, because these were practical, utilitarian documents, and sailors did need to know where they were, and they did need to know how to get back to where they'd been before. So this manuscript chart tradition really values eyewitness information. Over here, in this printed woodcut tradition, the consumers of this map, you know, are not going to use this map to try and get to Brazil. Not that necessarily that they were trying to use this map either, but this map, you'd have a much better chance to get to Brazil with the Cantino map than you would with the Waldseemüller map. The point being that the eyewitness information is not so important, and it's rather, you just need to make it seem like the parrot. So I think there's a huge slippage in the parrot here. Here we've got something we know is a parrot. This is a generic bird that might be a parrot or it might be something else. But in this mapping tradition, it was not so important to have the eyewitness information. Okay, the text on the two maps is very similar. In one, it's written in Portuguese, very easy to read. The other one's written in Latin, not as easy to read, but very similar information. So it's likely that Waldseemüller got his information from an intermediary chart between the Cantino and this one, probably the Calvario chart, which was of a few years after the Cantino chart. So we do have text that describes both places, so it's not just the images that are setting up what the places are like. And both maps are changing the way the ocean is projected and shown. So that on both maps, you get the sense that the ocean is no longer this vast unknown place. Now it's possible to sail across the ocean with our rum lines, or our nicely undulating sea here with the Waldseemüller. The oceans are named, so they're sort of domesticated in that sense. And Brazil is a place in the ocean. Brazil is a place that you get to by crossing the ocean. So there's the sense that it's distant, but you can get there. It's a place that can be known by traveling there, you know, with the aid of a chart like that, and that information will come back from Brazil that will add to other information that comes back from the Americas. So it's a land that can be known if one crosses the ocean. Okay, the symbols of possession on the map I think are really interesting, because you see with the Waldseemüller a lot of naming going on, and these are all more or less in Portuguese. So he's getting these names from other maps that he had in his possession, or that he had that he had consulted. And very clearly here, he's got the ship marked with the Portuguese flag. So the ship is saying, you can get to the ocean, you can cross the ocean and get to Brazil, such as the Portuguese have done, and here's the explanation of how they did it. Okay, our beautiful parrots, the importance of eyewitness information. This is what you will see if you go there. Okay, here, our slippage. The details not so important, not drawn from life, but it is saying sort of the same thing, that Brazil is a land of the parrots, okay? This is saying Brazil is the land of the parrots. This is saying it, but in a very different way. Okay, so now we get back to the very beginning, which was this question of maps as ephemera, okay? These two maps survive. The Cantino survives because it got given to the Duke of Ferrara, who was a great map collector, and despite various things that almost caused it to be destroyed through the ages, it survives. The Waldseemüller survived because somebody bound it into a book, okay? In both cases, though, I think probably there's the sense that both maps survived because they were recognized as being important works somehow. So they weren't thrown away. Most of the Waldseemüller maps were thrown away. If they made 1,000 copies, 999 were thrown away and only one survives. The Cantino, there was just one map made, but it survived. But so there's this sense that, maps aren't permanent. Portrayed charts get out of date. They're no longer up to date. What do? You throw them away. So there's a sense that you have to constantly make new maps. And for Waldseemüller, he in his career as a cartographer, he decided to kind of go back and completely redo his world map, and he comes up with another world map that's also at the Library of Congress, which is also on permanent display, of 1516. And this is the map. This isn't a very good image of it, but you get the feeling of it. And here is the text that he says that I think is suggestive of this idea of the map as a piece of ephemera, and also the idea that the cartographer has to pay attention to what the map viewers want. So he says, our previous representation, that's the map we've been talking about, pleased very few people, as we have lately come to understand. I have prepared the second image of the whole world for the benefit of the learned, so that not only would the new and present image of the world shine through, but also the natural change that has taken place in the intervening time. That you would have a unique view of what sort of things become perishable. So this is the new vision of the world, which, if you study this, it's more like the Cantino Chart. He's abandoned the Ptolemaic projection. Now you see Brazil looking the way it kind of looks shape-wise in the Cantino Chart. He's got the rum lines on it. He's got the compass roses on it. Okay? So he's saying that the way we showed the world in the old Ptolemaic projection is not really the way the world is. The world is more like this. And that's why our old map didn't please everybody. So here's our new map that we hope will please you. But he's suggesting already this idea that things become perishable. The old Ptolemaic map is a piece of ephemera. It's no longer valuable the way it had been just 10 years before. And, ta-da! How does Brazil appear on the second map? Where are our beautiful parrots? Where's our eyewitness information? We're getting into this sort of grotesque simplification of Brazil, the land of the cannibals. These are not eyewitness images. These are like your Braille images, right? You know, these are coming out of German artistic tradition. This is the German artist saying, well, this is how Brazil is. It's not the sailor coming back telling the map maker, you know, this is what the landscape looked like. This is the woodcutter in the print shop saying, oh yeah, I know how to decorate the map from Brazil. It's like this. And so what I want to try and do is show this transformation that occurs, that you have these different map traditions that are changing, and they're changing very rapidly. And in the process, the imagery on the maps is also changing. And I think that's very significant for establishing certain images that get repeated over and over again and that become iconic images that define Brazil. So I'll stop there. You've been very patient, and you guys can talk, ask questions, whatever you like. I'll come sit down so you guys can. Yes?
I have a question about the
Waldseemüller,
who was the audience? Because he made a bunch of them, so were they for like the universities? I mean, who would want such a map?
They would have been purchased. First of all, I should have added the Cantino map cost. What was the? I think it was 20 ducats. Okay, the Waldseemüller cost 3 ducats, which was fairly cheap because you got a lot, and you put it up on the whole wall of your house or whatever. Who bought it? Humanists bought it. Merchants bought it. Even high-end, middle-class, printers, craftspeople could afford to buy it.
And it was more for like decoration as opposed to information?
Yeah, I mean, it was meant to go up on a wall. It was meant to be a big, imposing thing, but you didn't have to mount it. So if you kept the sheets, the sheets are like that. So you could lay them out on a table and study them. But I think most people mounted them on a wall, which is why they don't survive, because it's like old wallpaper. You get tired of it after a while. Yes.
I have a question related to that one. Like, how was the configuration of the production of the map? Because I imagine somebody who invested in that, because you have several people involved, so the people who traveled there, then the people who were here. So were the investors
With which map? With both maps or?
Like in general,
okay.
How did it work producing maps? Because you mentioned it was expensive, all the wood work and all that, and artists.
Well, okay, so normally for the woodcut map, normally the printer would cover most of the expenses and would want to go sell, and so why are there mistakes? Because the printer didn't take the time to get it proofread properly, because he wanted to get the thing printed and taken to Frankfurt, the book fair and all the other cities, and sell. But in this particular case, in Waldseemüller's first map, he had a patron who was his name was it either Prince Henry or Duke Henry of Saint-Dié, which is Alsace-Lorraine, and so he was under the patronage of this particular prince, who probably paid, and maybe they ran out of money, which is why they had to go to a cheaper printer and why the kind of production values went down. In the case of the Cantino, first of all, we don't know who made the map. I have my ideas, but I can't prove them, so I can't tell you yet. But it was somehow, this Alberto Cantino paid a lot of money for it. 20 ducats was a lot of money to a craftsman, to a cartographer. And so, and this was during a time when when the King of Portugal, had a penalty of death on people who gave out the maps. So why did the cartographer do it? Because he was getting 20 ducats for it. So that would have been a lot of money for him. So in the case of the Cantino, which was involved fewer numbers of people, it was a simpler process to produce. Yeah.
had a question. Up until this last slide, I was going to ask if your hypothesis was that the circulation from Staden's text might have led to the depiction of cannibals on perhaps the first map that you showed, the image of the cannibals, those from the 50s, right? This one's from 1516. And it seems like you're suggesting it was just sort of in the popular imagination, this craftsman decided to look this there. I wonder if you can go into any more detail about what you think was going on, or maybe what the people behind the production of the map might have thought of this. Could have been to help sell the map, or just, I don't know, I imagine there would have been some sort of a conversation between the craftsman and the people in charge. And also I wonder if how much of it might have been more erudite sources, like other sorts of texts that they might have consulted while they were consulting the maps that might have led to
This depiction of cannibalism?
Was this the first one on the map?
No, I mean, the second chapter is, kind of the evolution of the cannibal sign, which the first depiction of cannibalism on a map of Brazil is a manuscript map, which sort of seems to shoot holes in the argument that it's merging out of the printed maps. But I've got a way of getting around that, I think. But this, I mean, Lisa, you might want to answer this question. You've probably got something to say about that. Where is this coming from?
Well, you were going to say what the first depiction
The
is,
Kunst,
right?
It's along you're talking about the Kunstmann 2 map, the four-finger map. I should have brought a picture of it. I don't think I did.
Yeah, I can picture it too. But in the Vespucci text that describe cannibalism are circulating. So I think, and that's, the Vespucci woodcut is also probably earlier.
Yeah, I mean, this...
Very famous one with all the cannibals and they're under sort of a structure.
Yeah.
The feathered skirt and headdresses that comes through very...
Yes,
But you can see a little bit of
yeah. I mean,
feathered skirts.
the problem is that in 1516, when this, or 1515, say, when that was being drawn, there were not that many visual images of cannibalism. There were a few, not that many. There were more textual descriptions. And so, I mean, typically the artist who's illustrating a book has to come up with an illustration, because usually the printer, again, always eye on the bottom line, is not going to pay the artist to go to Brazil to see what it really looks like. And so, they have to have a decoration, and so this is coming out of the European imagination here. And so some of these, I think, are similar to the way Varthema was illustrated. So you get kind of this fudging of information about other people, so that you get this sort of overlapping kind of imagery that's sort of depicting Brazilian Indians, but sort of depicting Muslims, or sort of depicting Asians, and that's kind of what you're getting there. But the thing that I learned when I was researching the Staden images is that those images are very unusual. The original images are very unusual because usually the author and the illustrator did not talk to each other. It's kind of like today, not so much in the kind of books that we write, but in ordinary books that are written, even children's books, the author doesn't necessarily have control over the illustrations. And that's kind of what I think is going on there. So that's why I think it's so important to look at the artist. The artist is making an intervention here, and it becomes very powerful because it's on the map. So it's physically associated with a specific place. Yes?
All right, thank you. Thank you for your talk.
Oh, sure.
I learned a lot, and I have a question. I wonder about the dynamics between the maps and conquest.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, this is the time of the Portuguese conquest, studying history, or maybe a little later than the arrival of the first colonizers or conquistadores. And I wonder if there's any indication that the colonizers actually had any kind of influence or any impact in the artists that do these maps, and if the another in some way, so there were totally separated processes?
Well, that's hard for Brazil because we don't really have a conquest, and these are so early. We don't even have a royal governor in Brazil yet. So I mean, I think you'd see that more in Mexico, but in Brazil it's hard. It's really hard to make that connection, and that's why I think it's so important to understand the Portolan tradition and to understand the importance of the sailor. Because it's the sailor who brings back a lot of information and shapes a lot of perceptions, not so much the conquistador, So the sailors are going all over the place too. Yes?
I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about the fact of secrecy
Uh-huh.
and then the lag between actual information collected and then the lag of when it gets put on maps.
Yeah. Well, that's controversial, as Isabel can tell you. I mean, the idea that the Portuguese had this policy of secrecy, goes back to work of Jaime Cortesão. But a lot of scholars don't buy it anymore because all of this information, it's in Germany already. I mean, how secret could it have been, And this Cantino map, it was argued that it was a copy of the king's master map, the Padrão Real, or the Padrão Real. There's no evidence that Portugal, that nobody's ever, it's inferred that a Padrão Real existed in Lisbon. Nobody can find a single document that actually describes it. So I think that this particular map was made by an ordinary cartographer, a very good cartographer, who had in his shop a lot of charts, who knew a lot of sailors, and he put together this composite map of the world. And obviously, he wasn't too worried about this policy of secrecy because he sold it. Now, granted, the guy left Portugal right away. He went to Genoa, and then a few years later, an almost exact copy of this map comes out, the Canario map from Genoa. So, I just don't think it. They may have tried, but I don't think it really holds water anymore because too much of that information was circulating all over Europe, and the cartographers themselves were circulating too. Somebody, let's see, did you already ask a question? Okay, who else wants to ask? Okay, here you go.
Oh, this is getting back to the question of the artists. Something that you see a lot in manuscript illumination of all kinds is sort of two sorts of phenomena. The creation of schools. So,
Yeah.
that you can see patterns in the way that landscapes are represented, or even letters, or
Right.
and trees.
Right.
And then, what I know a little less about, but read something about in terms of woodcuts, that you have that same practice, but also you share woodcuts. So I'm wondering if between the two of you, if you know about, if you can see the use of either standardized wood, artistic representations of animals, or trees and birds, and coastlines on one hand, that might lead you to think there are schools of artists working with woodcuts, right? Or the actual borrowing and lending of woodcuts, which is usually
Oh, you mean between printers? Yeah.
since they're very expensive to make.
I don't know if we're going to be able to see this. Let me go back. I thought I had another picture of this. Farther back. Ooh. Okay, there's a lot of standardization going on in Waldseemüller's map. So if you look at these mountains, for example, there are also little trees. You can't really see them, but it's almost as if there's a stamp that means tree, and so it's stamp, 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 stamp. So, obviously there are several woodcutters working on this map. Some of them are because all of this text has to be cut into the map. So there's probably 4 or 5 woodcutters working on this map. In addition to, I think, a designer who designed all of this, and a really outstanding woodcutter who did the border. The woodcutting in here is not nearly as great as the border or even the way they did the ocean.
So if I could follow up on that question.
Uh-huh.
If you do see these two ways of kinds of standardization, you want to call that, one through mass reproduction of schools, ways of representing the world that are taught, and then the actual, perhaps even the use of the recycling of woodcuts. How does that fit with the thesis of maps shifting and showing us shifting views of the world?
Well, I don't.
Perhaps they're really conventionalized, recycled bits and pieces of views.
Yeah, I don't think we're yet to the point where we have schools, and the signs on the map are still really varied. We don't. I mean, it's heading towards more standardization, but it's not standardized yet. And so even imagery like cannibalism, there are various different ways in which cannibalism is portrayed. One was on the Munster map, was the teepee with the legs hanging out of it. The other was the guy with the leg on a spit. Another is the arm hanging out of the, so it's not really standardized yet. So you're suggesting that maybe that a certain school would reproduce it. I mean,
yeah, I'm asking you because I'm not an expert on the woodcut, but if we were looking at medieval illumination, for example, here's an image of paradise. Well, that image could be very similar from the 12th to the 15th century because of, and can tell us a little bit about, or reliable evidence about shifting attitudes towards paradise, because they're really very conventionalized, following sort of almost artistic standards.
Yeah. Well, I think we can definitely see it, when you go from the Cantino depiction of Brazil to the later one. What is it? This one. This is much more conventional. Doesn't have the feeling of new information. It's almost they're repetitive patterns in this one, and the same thing's true with this. So I think there is movement over time. If I'm understanding, maybe you can help me out here.
This would be a follow-up question, but kind of how I understand your argument at the end is that while Waldseemüller adopts the Portrayed techniques and moves in that direction, which is an emphasis on greater accuracy, right? But it's not, there's not a simple story to tell about maps and cartography moving in that direction, because at the same time it is adopting that technique, it's also inserting much more conventionalized imagery. Is that how?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated story that goes this way, then this way, then yeah.
So what you're trying to tell us about that sort of tension and
yeah, and I'm trying to figure out, because I just don't buy this idea that Europeans imagined America. I mean, I think there was a lot of information that came from real eyewitnesses who were there. Now, yes, there's all kinds of fantastic myths and so forth that percolate through it, but I don't think it's just a projection of the European mentality on the Americas. There's something very immediate that's coming from the encounter itself, and that's what I'm trying to get at, is that these artistic images, yes, they're coming out of the European imagination, but there's also something about the encounter and the physical experience of being in the Americas that's affecting the images as well. And I think it's a tension, because I think in the end the print's going to win out. We all know that. The manuscript maps are going to continue, and they're going to be valuable as decorative items, but eventually it's the printed map tradition that's going to survive. So these images, what happens to the images is really significant, because how many people saw the Cantino map and how many people saw the Waldseemüller map? And so it's sort of mushrooming power of the images on the printed maps as opposed to the manuscript maps. Yes?
Yeah, it's kind of a follow-up question to my first one. Some of my classes were talking about the audience for the different texts. So I was wondering if you feel that like sometimes the audience of an intended map was affecting how the map was being produced or being put on the map, or how that.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, they want to see that there's a lot of gold here.
Right.
I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's some evidence that the illuminations were paid for individually. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay, it's 6 ducats, or whatever. So the audience definitely plays an important role, and that's one of the problems we have, because which charts survive? The more elaborate, the more illuminated, the more, luxurious, those are the ones that are most likely to survive. And the ones that were used until they wore out, or were lost in a shipwreck, those we don't have. Did you have a question back there? No, okay. Yes,
I have a question.
Lucia.
I am currently working on, texts produced around the time of the conflict, like, for example, the Dutch invasion in Brazil.
Uh-huh.
And I am studying some texts produced by Spaniards who should be very well informed about maps in Brazil. And in some texts, they are portraying Brazil or describing Brazil as an island.
Oh, yeah.
Why? And then it goes back to are they trying to kind of mislead some like the Dutch, or what is it? Because I was surprised.
No, that's a persistent idea that Brazil is an island, because if you think about it, between the Amazon and the Paraná, Paraguay, it just seemed like water, 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 water. And there were a few maps that did portray Brazil as an island. The problem was that once it got written down and printed and read, the misinformation was repeated over and over and over again. Yeah.
But it is surprising that at the point that we have so many maps already depicting Brazil not as an island, and then it's almost like there is a contradiction here, because people, well-informed people, should be aware of the fact that Brazil is not an island.
Yeah. I can't remember. I know one of the maps that has Brazil as an island was made by Jean Rotz, who was a kind of English-French map maker who had been to sea many times. So it's interesting to get the sort of sailor or the go-between's perspective in map making. But, there's a lot of, nobody had explored very far. And so those ideas tended to get reproduced until
like the discovery of the Amazon, because that's around 1620 something. Because
earlier.
No, but the book that's produced, it's it's written around that time. Like the discovery of the Amazon.
Yeah, and I think it's also like with Waldseemüller. As a humanist, he really privileged his written sources. That's what counted. And in the first map. And so, sailors' information, okay, that's useful, but we've got to be careful, can't trust the sailors. But then the second map, he suddenly, there had been so much change in that time period that he was willing to accept that. So I think that idea of Brazil being an island is something that's sort of repeated over and over again in texts, and so it takes on, it becomes true, like Garcia Marquez would say. Yes.
I have a question.
Sure.
Back to the cannibals. And I was wondering if there's any indication of what caused this paradigm shift from Brazil as the island of the country of parents to Brazil, the country of cannibalism. Was it maybe related to this Bush text? If it was, then how come it was not represented in the first map that already included part of the Bush text in this book?
Oh, good question. Okay, so, well, it's very interesting. Nobody likes to talk about cannibalism, but everybody wants to hear about cannibalism. So I have to be very careful what I say. Well, you'll probably like whatever I say. Okay, here's something really interesting. The Portuguese don't put cannibalism on their maps very often. It's very interesting, and the early Portuguese settlers in Brazil had kind of a modus vivendi with cannibalism. You know, it's okay, you know, just don't come cannibalize us, essentially. And so it does not become, you know, it does not become such an important thing on the Portuguese maps that were drawn in the Portolan tradition. I mean, this one here that I showed you is unusual. And then you get depictions of cannibalism in the French atlases, but it's very matter of fact. This is the way the houses are. This is the way they go to war, as you know, depicted visually. This is how they capture their prisoners. This is how they kill their prisoners, and this is the cannibalism ceremony that ends. So it's not really sensationalized at all. So the sensationalism of the cannibalism comes not first on the maps, but first in the text. So like the document you were mentioning, the broadside that goes with the Vespucci letter of, what is it, 1504, I think. And then some of Columbus's early letters were illustrated with images of cannibalism that had nothing to do with anywhere in the Americas. And so those images start to circulate. Vespucci describes cannibalism in both of the published letters, but in the Soderini, which was in the book that went with the Waldseemüller map, was much more elaborate. That's where he tells the story that, you know, one of the sailors was killed by a woman, of course, and with great glee cannibalized him. I mean, that's sort of, that kind of lurid story starts to spread and eventually comes onto the maps, but it does not come through the manuscript tradition. I think, but I'm not sure, that with this one or two exceptions, it kind of gets its, you know, this kind of depiction that we saw at the very end on the last slide is coming from the printed tradition and not from the manuscript tradition. You want to comment on that, Lisa? No?
Well,
Because well, never mind.
yeah, no, I think that's right. That's right. I was actually going to conclude with a kind of silly question.
Oh, okay.
A more serious one. But I was just to return to the idea of Brazil as the land of parents. I was just curious if you had seen the film Rio with anyone.
Oh no, I haven't seen it. Yeah.
And thought about how, you know, at this time that, I mean, Rio, you know, but you know what it is?
No.
It's an animated film. It's not Disney, is it?
I've heard about it. I haven't seen it.
You've heard about it, but the main characters are parents.
Oh, you're kidding. Oh my gosh, I've got to see this.
Yes. But I think, I mean, it really, I mean, this is a mainstream Hollywood film for kids introducing Brazil, and I think it's fascinating that it's
the parrot. Yeah, well, there's, It's interesting because there's certain images that become huge in, you know, Alicia can tell you, in Brazilian self-perception, and they come from these maps: the cannibalism, the parrots, the hammocks, abacaxi, you know, it goes on and on.
Quick question again, just occurred to me at the conclusion of the talk. Waldseemüller talking about letting learned people getting insight into the things of the world that are the things that are perishes. Are we to assume that he's thinking of his first map or the natural world?
He's thinking of Ptolemy's knowledge and his first map. You know, Ptolemy's now out of date. My first map's now out of date. So, yeah. I realized when I read that was not very clear, but that's what the sense that I was trying to get across.